Hello everyone, my name is Kaylin Whitner and I'm a Master's of Science student at Eastern Illinois University. I'm studying nutrition and dietetics with the DI option. This systematic review presentation is for the class NTR 5600, and the topic I will be presenting on is looking at the impact of breastfeeding on flavor preferences and food intake. Here's the overview of what I will be discussing in this presentation. First, I will be defining some words that I feel are important in understanding this presentation. Next, I will introduce the topic and why it is important to study, along with the research question and purpose statement. Then I will go into the methods I used when going through the search process to find my data. Next, I will discuss those results from the search and conclude what the results are. Next, I will summarize my findings, discuss strengths and weaknesses, then finally talk about limitations and future implications, as well as the direction for research and professionals. Starting off with some key definitions, I want to define the differences between flavor preferences and food acceptance. Flavor preferences is the specific flavor profile that a participant tends to favor or recognize. These flavor profiles are bitter, sweet, savory, sour, and umami, which are the 5 basic flavor profiles we are all familiar with. As far as food acceptance, this is a bit different and looks at specific foods the participant chooses to eat over the other. For example, they would have a better food acceptance with a hamburger if they frequently chose to eat it over a salad. Typically, flavor preferences are what determines food acceptance. Measuring and determining the infant's flavor preference and food acceptance within infants and children can be difficult, especially within the infant since they are unable to speak yet. It is important to use multiple measures to get an accurate result because the evaluator could misinterpret one and skew the results. The FIB-FECS is a coding system used for coding videos. This system is evidence-based and has 13 different items to measure. A few ways the evaluators measure the food acceptance is with avoidance and facial expressions. These measures include the infant turning their head away, arching their back, pushing the spoon away, crying and fussiness, leaning forward, and rate of acceptance. As far as the facial expressions, the negative expressions are measured by lowering their brows, squinting, nose wrinkling, lip pursing, and gaping. If the infant score is low, the more they accept that food. Using this coding system can reduce subjective ratings. Some of the studies I will be looking at use a Likert scale for the mother and evaluator to rate the overall acceptance that was observed. However, this coding system will further confirm or deny those ratings to give an overall evaluation and to eliminate bias and skewed results. Throughout the presentation, you may see the abbreviations BM, FF, and DEB. BM stands for breast milk and may also refer to breastfed infants. FF stands for formula fed, and DEB stands for duration of exclusive breastfeeding. Keep those in mind throughout the presentation. Of the 5 basic flavor profiles, 2 of those are inborn, those being sweet and bitter. This means that there is no exposure needed for them to recognize these flavors. There is an inborn positive reaction to sweetness, and they are now finding out saltiness as well. And then a negative reaction to bitterness. This is not a learned behavior, but rather biology. This is because humans need to be able to detect when something is toxic and whether they should eat it or not. Bitterness is supposed to trigger a negative response because it is related to poisonous plants and should be steered clear from. There is also a genotype that has been linked to bitter sensitivity. The gene TAS2R38 has 2 DNA variations, PAV and AVI, and depending on which one the person carries, that determines how they are able to taste bitter foods, whether that be bitter sensitive or bitter insensitive. As they develop and are exposed to more foods through amniotic fluid, breast milk, and solid food, their taste preferences evolve. The most sensitive and critical time in one's life for taste preference is the ages 1 through 3. Cohort studies have been shown that the flavor experiences in infancy have transferred to childhood and adolescence. The mother's breast milk contains flavors from their diet and the environment. For example, flavors like garlic, carrot, vanilla, and fruit. The composition of milk is lactose, glutamate, sodium, and urea. These account for the flavors of sweet, umami, salty, and bitter, respectively. The variation of breast milk is described as colostrum, foremilk, and hindmilk. It is generally creamy, thin in concentration, sweet, smooth in mouthfeel, and watery. There are many benefits to breastfeeding. As most of us know, breastfeeding is the preferred method of infant feeding. Not only does it provide all the essential nutrients needed, it also has immune benefits and other influencing factors as well. For example, the prevention of atopy, which has been linked with breastfed infants. Atopy is a reaction such as eczema, asthma, and allergic reactions. Also, evidence has suggested that there is a link between type 1 diabetes and a shorter duration of breastfeeding with an early introduction to cow's milk. This is also suggested with type 2 diabetes and obesity as well. Like I mentioned in the last slide, there is different compositions in a feeding, such as the foremilk and hindmilk, which helps with satiation and making sure the infant receives all macronutrients and volume of water. It also helps with the emotional and physiological factors for both the mother and the baby. The recommendation worldwide is exclusive breastfeeding for 6 months and then complementary feeding for the next 6 months. Obviously, this can vary realistically based on cultural differences. Child pickiness, or in other words, food neophobia, is the avoidance of unfamiliar foods. This is caused by many factors such as anxiety, parental and peer influence, and the parental diet. What I am trying to show within my systematic review is how breastfeeding can possibly lessen the pickiness a child has. Breastfeeding has always been an interest of mine ever since nutrition through the life cycle in undergrad. So I knew I wanted to focus on breastfeeding for my systematic review. I also want to become a lactation consultant in the future, so doing this research now can help prep me in knowing more about this topic and where I can take my future research. The purpose of this systematic review is to help dietitians to improve education with mothers in order to create a healthier, more diverse diet with their children starting early in life, which then leads to the research question posed, which is assessing the impact of breastfeeding on flavor preferences and food intake of infants and children. Originally, I had focused on flavors from the maternal diet, specifically influencing flavor preferences of infants. But after researching the topic, I wanted to broaden it to include breastfeeding as a whole and including children to observe long-term effects. I also decided to include food acceptance, which encompasses their diet as a whole, because in the longer-term child studies, they looked more at the dietary variety of foods accepted based on what the mothers consumed during breastfeeding, rather than just the flavor preferences. So broadening the research question allowed me to find more information and make better conclusions on this topic. Now I will be getting into the literature review portion. During the search process, 3 databases were utilized through Booth Library at Eastern Illinois University. These databases were PubMed, CINAHL, and PsycInfo, with PubMed being the primary database for article collection. There were also other methods used in the search process. These included using the reference lists of credible articles related to my topic to find articles that I may have missed during the database search. The next method was finding the trends in authors. There were 2 to 3 authors that I saw frequently, and one of those being Julie Mennella. Mennella was the primary researcher in this field and had vast knowledge on the topic. I decided to look at her other research and related authors, But I didn't just stop there. I decided to email her academic email asking for other resources she may be aware of that I may have missed. She provided great resources, and I found additional articles that way. With my target population being lactating mothers and their breastfed infants or children, the inclusion criteria had to be strict. The inclusion criteria were looking at articles between 2007 to 2020. However, I do have one article that is in 2001 because it was too good to exclude. This was extended to 2007 because there was great research done in those years and I did not want to miss out on the literature. However, 7 of the 12 were within the 10 years or newer. There also had to be mother-child dyads because that was the target population and the basis of my study. There also had to be breastfeeding involved because that is a part of my research question and what I'm studying. The articles had to be looking at flavor or food preferences or increased dietary variety because this was the outcome I was trying to determine. They also had to be from peer-reviewed journals, and the article itself had to be primary. As for exclusion, this was the opposite of the inclusion criteria. The articles were excluded if they were older than 2006. There was no sign of determining any preferences. There were only formula-fed infants involved, and animal studies were also excluded. Also, comorbidities and disorders were excluded because most studies did this anyway, but also this can change the feeding practices and determining the child's preference. I chose not to limit location because breastfeeding is an international practice and any woman who is able to and chooses to can breastfeed their child. Here is my Prisma diagram. I utilized this diagram to keep track of the amount of articles I found and how many I narrowed down, as well as the types of studies they were. When completing the search process, I used the terms breastfeeding and food preferences and breastfeeding and flavor preferences. And this was able to encompass everything I was looking at, yielding me an initial 409 articles through the databases. Through my other search methods, there was a total of 415 articles. After duplicates were removed, there was a total of 275 articles. I then screened the articles through titles and abstracts with my inclusion and exclusion criteria, and I came up with a total of 83 articles. I skimmed through these and excluded an additional 50 articles. After reading the articles that were left, I excluded an additional 20 articles, leaving me with 12 final primary articles that contained my inclusion criteria. 6 of these studies were qualitative, 2 of them were quantitative, and 4 of them were mixed methods. Here's the data collection tool I used via Excel worksheets. I decided to break down the data collection Excel spreadsheet by 10 different criteria, those being author, year, location, sample method, design method, sample size, purpose, intervention, measure, and results. This made it easier to compare the studies as a whole and be able to determine the commonalities and differences. I have organized all the data by year, so you're going to see it going from the oldest to the newest studies. I wanted to point out that the sample method of my studies were comprised of experimental or intervention studies as well as cross-sectional studies. As you see here, I have 1 cross-sectional study within the 5 studies. The other 4 were experimental or intervention studies, and as you can see, 3 of the 4 interventions contain fruits or vegetables. All of the intervention studies were introducing those same foods to the mother during lactation and then exposing the child to those solid foods when they were weaning. As you can see, the last study on here looks specifically at the different flavor profiles instead of specific foods. So they're measuring for sweet, salty, bitter, sour, and savory solutions to determine specifically the flavor preferences instead of food acceptance. All of the intervention studies use similar measures, like I stated before with the FIB-FECS coding system. These multiple measures are important when being able to determine results. Some of these include the spoon refusal, facial expressions, duration of feeding, and total intake. In addition to those, the Likert scale was used in every intervention by both the parents and those non-biased evaluators that were evaluating via video recording. For the cross-sectional studies, you're going to see a lot of questionnaires and interviews, and this just looks at what the mother ate and how long she breastfed, and then now what the child eats during their childhood. The results for the first study shows a positive result showing breastfed infants preferred carrot over plain cereal. And then the second study shows no significance with green bean consumption. However, they did accept peaches, so the exposure through the breast milk did not correlate to the acceptance of green beans. The third one shows that the longer the breastfeeding, there was a greater acceptance of new foods. This is just an overall observation based on the cross-sectional study. The fourth study shows that breastfed infants and their experience with vegetables showed more acceptance of new foods. Since this study was introducing so many different vegetables, they were more looking at food acceptance and if the breastfed infant was more likely to accept different foods during weaning than other infants. The last one didn't really show a strong correlation. It did show positive reaction for umami and sweet, but less towards the other groups. This result is typically hypothesized because breast milk does have strong flavors from the lactose and glutamate, which then translates to the sweet and umami flavors that the child then perceives. So as you can see, the design method for all of these are either qualitative or mixed, but none of them being quantitative. So these results are just based off observation, interpretation, and self-reported data. Moving on with the next 5 articles, this one includes the article that I sent out to the class, and that one is highlighted in blue. Looking at these sample methods, there's only 2 on here that are intervention and 3 that are no intervention, one of those being cross-sectional, the other one longitudinal survey, and the last one a prospective cohort. For these 2 intervention studies, they are specifically looking at flavor preference. The first one is looking at the transfer of the decarvone powder to the acceptance that the child has towards the flavor in the solid food. In this case, it was potato puree. And the other intervention is mixing water with different flavor compounds. So the lactose is translating to the sweet flavor, NaCl is translating to the salty flavor, the citric acid is the sour flavor, urea is the bitter flavor, and glutamate is the umami flavor. And like I mentioned previously, the measures are similar again. With this first one, they are looking at spoon refusals as well as the Likert scale. They also included questionnaires of the amount eaten and duration of feeding. For the other intervention, they're mostly looking at weight to determine the consumption and how much that infant enjoyed it. So their measures are a little bit more limited than the other studies. As for the other 3 articles, like I mentioned earlier, you're going to see a lot of questionnaires and interviews as well as food frequencies and diet recalls because those are popular in obtaining the data, and then interviews also help with the compliance. So you're going to see a lot of interviews being taken place. As for the results, again, they are varied and the 5 studies show different results. In the first one, they mentioned that their hypothesis was not supported because of the initial acceptance ultimately disappeared after repeated exposure, but they did find that breastfeeding did influence the acceptance of foods. And for the second one, there is a positive association between a healthy dietary pattern and breastfeeding. And this was determined based on food frequency surveys and other things like that. The third one is a little bit more confusing since they are also looking at the duration. So they noticed that at 6 months of exclusive breastfeeding, there was a positive effect of the umami flavor acceptance, but not at the 12-month mark. That may be because, like in the first study, that the initial differences disappeared throughout time and repeated exposure. That could also translate to this study as well in their findings. There was also a positive correlation between the bitter flavor and duration of exclusive breastfeeding at 6 months. And there was a negative correlation between sour flavor and duration of exclusive breastfeeding at 12 months. And finally, at 6 months, sweet and salty flavors were preferred. In the fourth study, it was concluded that any breastfeeding and exclusive breastfeeding duration were positively associated with frequency of food and drinks in the categories of fruits and vegetables, and inversely related to the consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages. So overall, there was a healthier dietary pattern found because they weren't consuming sugar-sweetened vegetables and frequenting more fruits and vegetables. In the last study of the results showed that breastfeeding duration may influence vegetable intake in the Japanese toddler's diet. However, there was no influence on the fruit consumption, and there was no obvious sign that the age of introduction was going to inhibit the food acceptance. As for the design methods, we got a mix of results here. We have 2 qualitative, 1 mixed, and then 2 quantitative. Looking at the sample sizes on the studies with no interventions, you see a larger sample size because more people were able to participate because it was a one-time survey and it was self-administered instead of going to the lab and having interventions. The compliance was easier, so you're going to see that with most of the no intervention studies, that the sample size in those are relatively larger. Here are the final 2 articles that we are looking at. The first sample method is cross-sectional and the other is an intervention. The intervention study is looking at the exposure of vegetable juice and how it then translates to greater acceptance. But they also look at when those exposures are introduced to the infant as well. Looking at the measures again, they are very similar to what we typically see with cross-sectional and intervention studies, like I've mentioned. For the cross-sectional, we see questionnaires and food frequencies, and for the intervention, we see a spoon refusal, Likert scale, duration of feeding, amount consumed, and facial expressions. As for the results for the first study, it was shown that breastfed infants' preferences were significantly related to maternal diet during breastfeeding exclusively. They were able to determine this by asking the mothers their specific food variety during exclusive breastfeeding and then the food preference of their preschool-aged children through food frequency and questionnaires. The sample size also benefited them because it was relatively large at 220 mother-child dyads. This helped with the reliability of the results. As for the results for the second study, it was shown that mothers with a wider variety of vegetables showed that their infants had greater acceptance of vegetable juice, and the sooner they were exposed, the greater acceptance. However, there was greater acceptance at 1 month rather than at the 3-month duration. Looking at the design methods, this is going to be the last qualitative study and the last mixed method study. So overall, like I've stated, most of these are going to be qualitative because of the measures that they're looking at. Infants are hard to determine explicitly what they are preferring, and determining their flavor preferences is overall something that you can't measure quantitatively. One thing I want to point out before I move on is that I purposely made sure that the sample sizes were relatively large in all of these studies. The lowest sample size I had was 45 mother-child dyads, and all the other sample sizes were larger than that because I wanted to get a diverse sample with reliable results. I'm going to take time to discuss the primary article I sent out to the class. I chose this article because the procedure is very straightforward and easy to understand. A lot of my other studies that I had chosen looked at several different interventions, and it could get confusing at times. But this one that I chose had just one food introduction, and I wanted the class to be able to follow the methods easily. The methods and measures are similar to the other studies and have been a standard practice for conducting this research on infants from what I've seen. This particular article had 58 dyads, and the sample came from Denmark. The participants were recruited via the Danish Civil Registration System in Copenhagen for a 28-day crossover intervention. The purpose of this article was to explore the role of breastfeeding and maternal dietary flavor intake and acceptance of novel flavors in weaning foods. The subjects were randomly assigned to a group, and these groups consisted of lactating mothers to either consume caraway hummus or plain hummus, with the caraway being the intervention. Mothers were told to consume 75 grams of plain hummus or 75 grams of hummus with the caraway. Dicarvone is the unique flavor compound in caraway that is highly transferred to the breast milk, so the caraway hummus included 30 milligrams of the dicarvone flavor. This was done for a total of 10 exposures. They consumed this 2 hours before breastfeeding, and after the exposures, the infants were fed 125 grams of caraway-flavored potato puree. They were fed the same time each day with the same equipment, and mothers not making any facial expressions to sway the infants and get them to eat. Mothers rated the child's acceptance on a 7-point Likert scale and kept track in a diary. After the home exposures, they were evaluated in a laboratory and were videotaped during the feeding. Again, the mother was feeding the infant with the same equipment from home and showing no facial expressions. The acceptance was measured based on the amount eaten, duration of feeding, spoon refusals, and a Likert scale scored by trained, non-biased evaluators via the videotape session. The results showed that there was no difference between breastfed infants and formula-fed infants' acceptance of foods because the acceptance ended up disappearing after repeated exposure to that food. They stated that regardless of if the flavor was exposed through breast milk, breastfed infants are more accepting to foods during weaning just because of the variety of flavors and the composition of the breast milk. They are already used to it constantly changing, compared to formula-fed infants. Even though this was relatively negative results based on their hypothesis, it still shows that breastfeeding as a whole can influence acceptance. In the end of my research process, I yielded 12 primary articles for the systematic review. The characteristics and demographics of the participants were diverse in race, similar in age, and similar in education when looking at all the studies as a whole. When comparing them, some had higher amounts of whites, blacks, or Asians based on the study's geographical region. This was because I had studies from Africa, Asia, or Europe. To be included in the study, infants had to be healthy and of normal weight, and this was similar for all studies. For the intervention study, the methods were similar in that they used similar measurements to assess the child's acceptance. For the cross-sectional studies, most of them used similar questionnaires to gain data for the demographics, length of breastfeeding, or when they started complementary feeding. And then they all used food frequencies or diet recalls. For the results of the studies, there were 10 positive results, meaning that there was a positive correlation between breastfeeding and flavor preference or food acceptance, and there were 2 negative results, showing either no correlation or a negative correlation between breastfeeding and flavor preferences or food acceptance. Between my 12 studies, I started out with 7,446 participants and ended up with 5,507 participants. 1,939 participants were excluded because of the feeding practices were not exclusive to breastfeeding or were not appropriate for the study. There were compliance issues, missing data, mothers no longer wanted to participate, they moved out of the testing area, did not follow up or could not be contacted, the child was sick on testing day, the child ate the maximum amount on testing day, the mother didn't deliver a healthy single born or had twins, she didn't successfully breastfeed, and the infant refused to eat on testing day. The locations from these studies were the U.S., specifically the East Coast, Australia, Japan, Europe, and Africa. Like I stated previously, location was not excluded because breastfeeding is an international practice. From what I concluded, the flavors from breast milk does not strongly correlate to specific flavor preferences from that food to the infant, enough to say that it is statistically significant and to draw that conclusion. The variation of breast milk tends to give infants a more varied experience, so they then enjoy the different foods and are more accepting to the changes in the diet and introduction of food. Therefore, the pickiness is less for those infants and children that are being breastfed. For the intervention studies, majority of them were impossible to be double-blinded because the mother would be able to tell what she was eating and needed to know what she was feeding her child. It is hard to conceal carrots and not have the mother know that she is eating carrots. However, in the study I sent out to everyone, they were able to conceal the caraway flour flavor by mixing it with hummus because it is a flavored powder rather than a known food. Double-blind is the gold standard for intervention studies, but it is extremely hard to use that method in research like this. There are some factors that can influence the results. Compliance is one because for most of the studies, they were at-home exposures or questionnaires. Although the researchers tried their best to make sure that the participants complied by calling them on the phone and using diaries, there still could be issues with this since they are not fully controlled by the researcher. Another factor is the transfer of breast milk and the concentrations of breast milk. Like I mentioned before, this varies per person. Researchers have also tried to control this by determining the amounts the mother is to consume and the timing of the breastfeeding. However, this is up to biology and does differ depending on the person and on the food. So this cannot be completely controlled. Another aspect is that texture can play a role in if the infant accepts the food. In all the intervention studies, the researcher used cereals and other foods that infants were already familiar with and accepting of before they added that flavor into them. This was to ensure that texture would not affect them and it was solely based on the flavor. However, for the cross-sectional studies, they only relied on food frequency and food diaries to report foods, so if the child was turned off by the texture when they first tried it, they're unlikely to eat that food again. And lastly, there are other factors that influence food acceptance. For instance, culture, parental and peer influence, and diseases. This determines what they can and cannot consume and plays a big factor when looking at the results of their cross-sectional studies. Although studies controlled for other diseases, that is still an overall factor that could influence their intake. To conclude, the research suggests that breastfeeding does influence an infant or child's flavor preferences and food acceptance. To review, my research question was assessing the impact of breastfeeding on flavor preferences and food intake of infants and children. The purpose was to help dietitians to improve education with mothers in order to create a healthier, more diverse diet with their children starting early in life. This research adds to the understanding of how a mother's diet can influence a child in their development of taste. Having this research will create more focused education for mothers who choose to breastfeed and can help them improve their child's nutrition quality of life. Again, with the methods, I used Prisma to organize my article findings from the 3 databases using PubMed, CINAHL, and PsycInfo, along with the reference lists. The results yielded 12 primary articles, with 10 being positive results and 2 showing no correlation or negative results. In conclusion, research suggests that breastfeeding does influence an infant or child's flavor preference or food acceptance. Some strengths of my study were that there was a good worldwide representation. I was able to find studies from 5 different continents, with some of them having multiple studies. This is unique to find such a wide variety of regions doing the same kind of research, so I found it important to include all of them and discuss them. Another strength is that there was strong inclusion and exclusion criteria for the studies. My research was specific in my target population and what I needed the studies to test, so narrowing down the research to exactly what I was looking at made it easier. The last strength is the use of Prisma and my data collection process. I stayed organized with Excel worksheets, which made it easier to compare the articles as a whole. Also, with the data searching, the use of Prisma was important because it helped me keep track of the amount of articles throughout the process and how I narrowed them down. As far as the weaknesses, some of the weaknesses were that the methods varied per article, so it was hard to draw a strong conclusion in the end. Each article used a different food intervention, and since these all get transferred differently through the milk, that sways the results. Also, some were cross-sectional and others were intervention, so the differences in those methods are widely varied and can cause for differing results as well, since cross-sectionals have more implications. The last weakness is that there were a limited range of different authors. I kept seeing the same ones over and over, especially within the US. This is good for the purpose of using similar methods, but bad for the diversity of studies. These were typically done in the same area of that country, and having the same person review the results typically draws similar conclusions because they have limited points of view. Future research should focus on longer cohorts. The research done now looks at infants with the highest age being 6 years old. If studies followed up with the preference of adulthood, we could determine if there's longer-term effects of breastfeeding on flavor preferences, or be able to determine other factors that affect flavor preference and food acceptance. Also, it would be nice to have more intervention studies so the research is more concrete. This allows for the researchers to know exactly what flavors the mother and infant are receiving, and they can look at those results directly instead of having cross-sectional studies where it's up to the mother to remember what she consumed during breastfeeding and how much. Another direction for future research should be sticking to one type of food for the intervention. Some of the studies that I looked at got confusing because they were introducing up to 5 different foods in the intervention. So it would be hard to tell directly which food or flavor is causing the infant to favor one over the other. The goals, as stated from my oral abstract, focus on improving education with mothers to have a diverse diet, understanding where a child's pickiness comes from and if it is caused by the mother's diet or just preference, prevention of food aversions in children and helping them to consume a healthier diet in the long run by starting early. All of these goals promote a varied diet in order for the child to meet the national recommendations of a healthy diet and prevent some chronic diseases. This topic is very interdisciplinary. With the involvement of infants and mothers, this is already a combined effort with the obstetrician and pediatrician. Adding breastfeeding and nutrition in there will include the dietitian and lactation consultant as well. So this research is not only beneficial for dietitians, but other healthcare professionals as well. OBs and pediatricians are part of the referral and education process, which can direct the mothers to a dietitian or lactation consultant in order to receive help and direct and detailed education. This research can help with understanding child's pickiness. As I stated earlier, dietitians can focus on preventing the child's pickiness from occurring and hopefully have less children develop those food aversions. This research can narrow down some of the education that needs to be provided. Having this understanding of how breastfeeding impacts child's consumption can allow the dietitian and lactation consultant to focus on the education directly on the mother's diet and duration of breastfeeding. Here are the references I used during this presentation. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to answering any questions you have in the discussion.